Legacy Builders, Strategies for Building Successful Family Enterprises. Brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. I'm your host, Cory Gagnon, and on this show, we explore global ideas, concepts, and models that help family enterprises better navigate the complexities of family wealth. Let's dive right in and start learning how to take control of your wealth and realize the lasting legacy you're intentionally working towards. Together, we're building legacies. Today, I'm excited to introduce our esteemed guest, set to shed light on the intersection of philanthropy and family enterprise. My goal is to be the most curious person in today's conversation with Gena Rotstein, a leading figure in Canada's social enterprise and philanthropy realm. Gena's journey is genuinely inspiring. Through her collaboration with Richard Ouellette, Carmen Sense emerged as an innovative social impact lab. Gena's story is colored by her unique perspective as a member of the rising generation, a cohort redefining wealth's purpose. With over 25 years of philanthropy management and a master's in nonprofit management and Jewish communal service, and a family enterprise advisor, she seamlessly blends family enterprise wisdom with her philanthropic dedication. Coming from a family business background, Gena's insights span legacy, growth, and societal impact. Her guidance to ultra-high net worth families weaves family values, financial success, and social change. Today, Gena, we're honored to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Are you ready to share your wealth of experience and insights with our audience?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Let's dive in. Gena, imagine you're delivering a commencement speech to a graduating class, and you have the chance to inspire them with your story. How would you begin your speech to convey the incredible lessons and expertise you've gained along your career?
So it's pretty daunting to think about inspiring others with my own personal story. But the one thing I would leave people with is about embracing failure and not being afraid to talk about what happens when things don't go the way that you plan.
Okay. And tell me more how that fits into your story.
Oh, sure. So I think any business owner in their entrepreneurial journey has had failures. In Canada, we tend to not talk about them a lot. And so it's always like a trial by fire. And I think that when we think about failure is actually one of the best, if not the best, learning tool that we have out there. And so whether you are part of the rising generation and taking on new leadership roles within an already existing family enterprise or family operation, or you're just about to start on your own journey, really embracing the fact that it's not all going to go the way that you plan it to go. And being comfortable in that unknown space. And it takes practice.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's really like in my own personal experience, that's when I have dove into really immersing myself in why did this not work? I came out the other side way stronger than when I ran away from, or I went in with some fear or trepidation to the challenge that was in front of me.
Right. And so many people are willing to share their success stories. And we, in our culture, it's so common, but actually sitting down and talking about struggles and how difficult it is to get to where people have gotten, and be it small failures or large, I think that in this day, we're still not there.
Absolutely. And I mean, that could be a whole other podcast.
Absolutely.
I've got stories. That could be a whole other podcast.
Oh, that's great. Gena, with your 25 years of experience in philanthropy, can you give a little bit of a story of, how you got to where you're at in your journey today with the work that you're doing at Carmen Sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was living in a community called Maplewood, New Jersey, working for the Jewish community outside of Manhattan when 9/11 happened. And the majority of my donors' husbands worked at Cantor Fitzgerald. So for those of you who know, Cantor Fitzgerald was on the top 2-3 floors of the World Trade Center. And we all know what happened with the World Trade Center. And so all of a sudden, my major donors became frontline recipients of the services that they had been supporting. And a lot of them, because I was running a women's division for the Jewish Federation, a lot of them really had no idea where their money came from, how it was managed, how their households were run. It just happened. And so when I was reflecting back on what had happened in 9/11, and that's, within 24 hours, George Bush had been asked by a reporter, what should we do? And he said, go shopping. I was like, I understood where he was coming from. It's a very economic financial decision and directive, but people don't fly airplanes into buildings because they can't go shopping.
Yeah.
There's like a whole other systemic issue there. And then when you layer that with the women who we're talking about major donors. So the minimum donation that they were making to our campaigns was $1,800 at a minimum. And it went up as high as, several $100,000. When they don't know how that money ended up in their bank account to make that charitable transaction, and their president is telling them to go shopping as the balm for the crisis that just ensued, I was like, there's something wrong with this system. And originally, I thought the problem was that charities weren't articulating their stories effectively to address the social issues that would drive somebody to fly an airplane into a building. And when I came back to Canada, that was the approach that I took to my consulting practice, was to work with organizations to help them really talk about the impact that they were having and why they were important. And for those of you who were in Alberta in the early 2000s, like money was flowing in the streets.
Absolutely.
And I quickly realized that the problem wasn't that charities weren't telling their stories effectively. The problem was that donors weren't asking the right questions. And they weren't asking the right questions, going back to the earlier point, is that if they don't fully understand the ecosystem of wealth, how are they going to understand the ramifications of the impact that philanthropy can have in a market? And it was around the early 2000s that we also started to hear out of the UK stuff around social enterprise, social purpose businesses. It didn't really become part of the Canadian lexicon until about a decade later. But it was in those early 2000s that I started to rethink how we do the business of philanthropy. And I stopped advising to charities altogether. I was working for a nonprofit management consulting firm and quit that job and really went full steam into helping donors set up their charitable giving strategies with an intention to really understand the ramifications of their giving, the ripple effect of their charitable activities. Because at the end of the day, all philanthropy is political. Right. And so if we aren't clear about how money is flowing into what areas and why we have the consistent crises that we have, whether it's housing or food security or mental health or whatever is the sexy of the day, then we're never going to solve those problems. And so my experience being a witness to the 9/11 and its aftermath has really shaped the approach that I take when we work with families setting up their charitable giving strategies, because it's not just about charity.
Right.
That's the language that we use, but that's not the 100% focus.
Now, not that you would ever want to be the president of the United States, but let's go back to George Bush's comments as president and on that day. And really, it's discussion of leadership. Gena, if you were to be in that moment, what is it that you would have said, or from your experience, maybe not talking to all of the American people, but let's just maybe say the folks that were the most impacted within that area that you were in?
Wow, that's a chutzpahdik question, as they would say. I don't think I have the balls to answer that. I would actually probably deflect it to somebody who's better equipped, because really, like, my perspective is really much on social system design, and it's not on governing a nation or playing geopolitics. So I don't feel comfortable answering that question in the way you phrased it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that if we were going to, like, if we want to take ownership for those societal problems that we have, so right now the Northwest Territories are under fire. We have a war in Europe that has ramifications well beyond the borders of Russia, Ukraine.
Yeah.
We have finally a government that recognizes that we have a housing crisis. And this isn't a housing crisis for just the homeless population. This is a housing crisis for multiple generations. We have an aging population that we don't have a care system for. And all of this is interconnected, right? So when we encourage farmers to sell their land to developers to build houses in a green belt, and we already know that we are facing a food security issue because we've lost 70% of our farms in the last generation and a half, we have a problem. We have a housing problem that has now morphed into a food security problem. When we see fires in the Northwest and literally glaciers melting, that means we're going to have a water problem. If we have a water problem, we have a food problem. So we have to stop thinking about these issues in their own silos, and we really need to start looking at how everything is interconnected, and then move away from this bifurcated model of for-profit, nonprofit, government. It's not even bifurcated now because now there's three of them.
Right.
Trifurcated, I guess. We have to move away from that and really start looking at who is best positioned to solve these problems, and how do we start to bring together all those who are best positioned, regardless of their corporate structure, to actually solve those problems. Right. And then we can figure out how to incentivize it, right? So do we incentivize on the front end? Do we with tax credits and investment credits, or do we incentivize on the back end for performance credits, or, and anything in between, so that it's no longer this binary conversation of, or polarizing conversation of, is climate change real? Like, who cares now?
Right.
Who actually cares if climate change is real? The North is on fire.
Yes.
We have a water issue. We have a housing crisis. We have people who are moving around the world because of war. These are things that are happening now that could have been prevented 2 generations ago if we had the foresight to actually look at the interconnectedness of things. So now let's stop debating whether or not something is actually happening and actually start thinking about what does it look like for 3 generations from now. Because if we don't start looking 3 to 7 generations from now, it doesn't really matter that the North is burning right today.
Right.
Because we're just not going to have the land. We're just not going to be prepared.
And Gena, what are those questions, a little bit out of the political leadership, but maybe more into the family leadership, and those that really can make a difference? What are the questions that you think they could be asking right now?
Well, and I think everybody can make a difference.
Absolutely.
So I just want to be very clear. This isn't only for a certain demographic to take this responsibility on.
Right.
And I don't even think it has to be leaders who are asking these questions. I think we as a human system have an obligation to ask ourselves, what do we want to leave behind? And, my grandfather, I come from a fairly large Jewish family in Calgary. And my grandfather was an immigrant and self-made, and very much part of that, Jewish story of on the prairies. And the one thing that I learned from him is that you can't take your money with you. So he was, maybe he did it purposefully, maybe he didn't, but that was the lesson that I learned from him. And so we have a legacy of our family that stems from him and his cousins and his brothers and his sister. And there's a story there. And so what I think we can be asking ourselves today is like, what is it that we're carrying? What pieces of our history are we choosing to take with us and put down and to carry down to the next generation? There's a story about how, you take this box, and inside your box is everything that you bring with you. So from the old country, you might bring your candlesticks, or in the Jewish community, you might have brought a Torah from the synagogue. But whatever's in this box is all this stuff that you brought with you, and it gets put in the attic. And then one day, the next generation has to go and clean out the attic, which is a royal pain in the ass for those of us who have had to do similar things.
Yep.
And they pull out that box and they open it up and they're like, oh, I don't know the story behind this. I wish I had asked these questions. And so they start to put in their artifacts with no stories, and it goes back into the attic. And then the next generation pulls that out and they're like, wow, we've got these candlesticks and we have an iPhone, and I don't know the story behind either of those, but I don't have anybody to ask. So I'm just going to put my own stuff in. And there's no continuity aside from having these artifacts. And so what we, as just, again, the human system, or as family leaders, if you want to call it family leaders, our job is to make sure that we put the tags on those artifacts that tell the stories of why they're in there. Why were those candlesticks important? Why was that iPhone part of the zeitgeist? Or whatever it is. And it could be because there's pictures on there and, they didn't know how to take the pictures off, which is like, there's these experiences that everybody has. And so I think that that's the responsibility that we have. Whether you call yourself a leader, or you're part of the rising generation, or you're not even in a family network system at all, but you're just a human living on this planet. We have an obligation to really understand why we're doing what we're doing and what we want to leave behind, and being really conscious about what it is that we're leaving behind. Right.
Yeah, that intentionality for sure. And going back to your grandfather and his story, Gena, tell me a little bit more of, you can't take it with you, because that statement is said by many and has such different meanings. Where do you think that his story fits in?
Yeah, so I think for us, or the way that I've interpreted it, is he set it up so that we would be safe, right? So he knew he wasn't going to take it with him.
Yep.
He came from nothing. He made himself what he made himself. There's like, the immigrant saga. And when he passed away, we had our own, like many families, we had stuff that we needed to take care of. And he made sure that we were taken care of. That doesn't mean, Warren Buffett says or somebody asked Warren Buffett about inheritance and legacy, and he said you should leave enough for your kids that they'll do something, but not so much that they won't do anything.
Yeah.
That's the idea.
Right.
It's, raise the next generation to be able to lead or make decisions or create something new, or be a contributing member of society in whatever way, shape, or form that reflects itself, but don't disempower them by giving them too much so that they can't fail. So going back to our original conversation, or the original question, when I say embrace failure, if we don't let people fail, they will never learn how to succeed.
Right.
We have made a series of societal failures, and we have set up a system to address those failures that's duct taped and paper clipped together. And then we've said to the charitable sector, you go solve it. But by the way, we're going to under-resource you because we feel guilty, or there's some sort of, weird approach to why charities can't actually be fully sustainable to solve these complex problems. And then we're going to reward people by giving them a tax credit for giving to these organizations, but only the ones that they think are sexy, or only the ones that fit their political lens. And then the other ones have to go and scramble and try and figure out where they're going to get their next dollar. It's the whole system, the way we've set up these the solution space is not actually based on failure.
Right.
It's based on a whole bunch of potential pilot projects. We are the graveyard of pilot projects in the charitable sector. And we keep reinforcing that model because there's so much ego tied into philanthropy, right? So when we think about, why do we keep repeating these same solutions and expect this different result? We have however many shelters are out there. Domestic violence shelters take up 89% of domestic violence budget donation dollars, but they solve 8% of the problem.
Wow.
Right? So that was a stat that came out in, I think, it was before COVID. So time has blurred together. Sometime around 2017, right? So we have an edifice complex. We understand when you put money into a shelter, you're going to get something out of it. There will be a building and there will be stuff happening inside that building.
Right.
Whether or not that stuff that's happening in that side of that building is actually addressing the fact that we have a gender-based violence problem that is rooted in a whole bunch of other stuff, whether it's the immigrant story or colonization or, multi-generational abuse or poverty, like all the things that lead to gender-based violence. Gender-based violence doesn't just happen.
Right.
There's a whole bunch of things that trigger that. And so as philanthropists, when we think about how are we going to solve these big, meaty problems, and we're only going to look at it from these siloed solutions because that's how the system has been set up, we're never going to solve them. We really need to start embracing the failure of what has not worked in those siloed solutions and come up with some reasonable approaches to managing the failure so that we can actually get beyond them. Because all we're doing now is just repeating.
Gena, let's go back to your comment about how you talked about your grandfather and making sure that you're safe. And you also then made mention of the duct tape solutions. And, society has set ourselves up where we can't actually realize that something isn't going to work. And instead, we just tape things together and instead of tearing it apart and knowing that we're going to be okay. And that part of the system can still work with a new solution. Where do you think that starts? How do you think we could have those solutions where we're okay that what we know today and that comfort zone we're in is just not tomorrow's solution?
Well, I think we all have to start with why, right? Simon Sinek has the 3 golden circles. So why, how, what? Once we understand our own personal why, like why are we doing this? Why are we trying? What's our mandate? What is our raison d'être? Once we understand that, then we can start designing how we want to show up in the world and what we're going to do to get there. And I think that we've put certain things at the center of the system that are not the why, right? So it might be when we talk about healthcare, we've said, well, the why is the doctors. Well, no, the why are the patients. We have to create a system that actually helps patients. When we talk about moving people on bicycles and putting bike lanes in, it's not about bike lanes. It's about how do we move people where they need to get to in the most efficient manner. It's not about cars. It's not about moving cars. It's actually about moving people. And so figuring out what needs to be at the center of each one of those questions and then designing, or again, the solutions are out there. There's 90,000 charities and another 160,000 nonprofits just in Canada. If we look at the United States, there's 1.6 million charities in the US, and they categorize charities and nonprofits differently, so I'm not going to get into it. But we have the solutions out there. We just need to start connecting the dots between those who are doing really cool stuff and actually have a scalable model with those who have identified the problem and just need the right connection point to get their solution connected to another solution. So we build that conduit or that bridge. So once we figure out our why, then we can figure out where we want to put ourselves within those complex issues.
Now, going back to your comment of Warren Buffett, there's a lot of connection there of other very wealthy individuals that have committed a lot of money to the charitable sector and to solving problems.
Mm-hmm.
How is it that people can get to that point? And with the wealth that Warren Buffett has, it is at maybe a different caliber, but still, when people have abundance and they've realized that they can create that safety for their family, what's the next step?
So when we get called in to work with families to help them set up their foundations, we don't start with a dollar amount. We actually help them figure out their why and what the roadmap would look like to get to that solution. So when we think about gender-based violence, well, we didn't start with the gender-based violence. We got there eventually, but as we iterated on different aspects within the giving portfolio, we realized that if we only focused on domestic violence, we're not going to solve the root problem. If we only focused on the role of girls in sports, we're not going to get to the problem. If we don't look at how does human trafficking play into this? Like, there's a whole bunch of things at play that affect, as I mentioned before, gender-based violence. So when we sit down with a family, we help them figure out their why. We figure out what it is what's their time horizon. So is this a single generation solution? Is this a multi-generation solution? We figure out their geography and their scope. So how big, how wide, how deep. And then we talk about the dollars.
Right.
Because once we've figured out what that giving portfolio is going to look like, or what that solutionscape looks like over that time horizon, then we can start to say, oh, if you want to accomplish this on your own in this fashion, this is what it's going to cost. And obviously it's not a hard number, but you can start to piece it together. But as I mentioned, these complex problems aren't solved by a single source solution. They are solved by having people connect to each other and ideas connect to each other and other solutions that are being done in other parts of the world connect together. And so when we sit down with families and they actually want to move the dial on a complex issue, it more often than not means that they're not the only ones coming to the table. There's an organization in the States called Lever for Change, and their whole mandate is to bring individual family foundations or individual donors together to solve complex issues by throwing money into a pool, and then those pooled assets are deployed to complex solutions space, into the complex solution space. And so it's not your $1 million and my $1 million doing our own thing in gender-based violence. It's $2 million doing a hyper-focused solution that might bring together a group of organizations in gender-based violence. Because our multiple effect is better than our single effect on a couple organizations, if that makes sense.
Yes. 1 + 1 = 3.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so it's not a dollar amount, but it's a mindset. It's coming from a place of abundance or something around the story. And going back to sharing those stories, and if it's a single generation, or maybe it's a generation that isn't even alive at the moment where things are being set up, how does that story get shared between those generations?
And everything is driven by ego, and all philanthropy is political, right? So we don't start with thinking about 5 generations. That's too daunting for most people. We start with, what do you want to see now? Like, on the day that you die, which is obviously within your lifetime, what do you want it to be on the day that you die? What do you want whatever the issue is that you're passionate about? What do you want that to look like? And then we start to think about the next level and the next level and the next level. So, can we solve a housing crisis in this generation? Absolutely. will it take a lot of work and some egos putting aside and some change in policy and leadership rethinking? Distinctly possible. I would argue, in all innocence, likely. But there's certain things that we're not going to be able to solve, right? Like that requires a whole bunch of other people who are not part of the philanthropic conversations to kind of get out of the way. So we have to work around it within the legislation. And the best way to do that is to start, again, identifying the players that come to the table with a curious mindset, with a sense of empathy, and who can make decisions without having to go and ask permission. And I think that having that agency is a critical piece to this problem, to all these social problems. And just because you give yourself agency doesn't mean you have agency, right?
Right.
It has to be reinforced from the outside. And it's great that you have the personal identity or the wherewithal to say that you know the solution and you've got the best solution, but you also have to come to the table and possibly hear that maybe there needs to be some tweaking, or we take your solution and it gets applied in this way, which might not be how you originally intended, right?
Right.
So it's not a straight line. And again, that's why we don't start with the dollar amount. We do talk about money. Don't get me wrong. Money comes up very early and very often. But it's not how we start the conversation. We start the conversation with imagining. And then, so going back to the essence of your question is like, what are the tools that we use? So some of it are visual tools. So we have one family where they created a map, so to speak, of all of their members, and it went like it was a circular map, and then underneath each member was like a little blurb, and it just kept going out and out and out. So it's more like a sundial, I guess, in a way. I don't know how else to describe it, or a constellation model. We've had others just do a linear timeline of their family history and put on their timeline inflection points that were really important to them. So their marriage, birth of their first child, the death of their spouse, whatever it was, that had these momentous, or, these moments that left these indelible marks in their psyche.
Yep.
And then we have people who have already had books written about their family. They come from a family legacy that was either brought over from the old world or the old country, or in the case, we're doing some work with some Indigenous communities, and their history is here. Like, it's actually written on stone, on walls, in parks. Like, they have a history. And so how do we honor those different ways of storytelling such that the inheriting generation actually understands what it is that they're being told? They're not just being handed a map with people's faces that they have no relationship to. Or they're not going to a provincial park and they're seeing pictographs on a wall without having context for why those are there and what happened on those lands. Like, so our job as philanthropy advisors is as much about helping people set up their foundations as it is about capturing stories and honoring legacy. And it's the whole idea of, it's not about your mother's pearls, it's about her pearls of wisdom. Like, how do we use the artifacts that are in that box, but actually make them a living story so that the next generation can pass those stories on? It's not a one size fits all for any family. Right. And Gena, we're coming to the end of our conversation today. And before we wrap up today's episode, there are a few questions that I ask each guest. Are you ready for the tough ones? The tough ones?
The tough ones, yes.
Oh, sure.
All right. Now, what is one key strategy you believe is the most essential for building a successful family charitable giving strategy?
The number one thing is know your why. So yeah, 100%. And I highly recommend reading Simon Sinek's book with Start With Why.
Or watching his TED Talk.
Or watching his TED Talk.
Yes, absolutely. And what is the most common challenge that you see family enterprises or family foundations encountering when it comes to wealth transition or generational continuity?
So there's a couple things. Most especially is that there's a lack of financial literacy in the inheriting generation. And so obviously that has ramifications beyond the foundation or the family philanthropy. And then, on top of that, there's this in some families, because that box that they took out of the attic didn't have the stories tied to those artifacts, there's this lost history or lost memory. And so really trying to hone in or tap back into the family values and the family history
right.
will, underlies or provides that foundational support.
Okay. And as far as, maybe a strategy for each of them, I think, the family literacy might be a little easier than going back and adding these stories to the box.
Yeah. And I mean, none of this is easy, right? Managing family, whether you are the patriarch or the matriarch, or you're the advisor in and working with and supporting to or in service of families, is always challenging because people are challenging. So the strategies that I would say, well, when it comes to financial literacy, please go find somebody who knows how to teach this in an effective manner, such that whoever's at the table, whether it's for yourself or your kids or your grandkids or whatever, you all hear and learn together. Definitely not my qualifications. I can help you give the money away when you're ready. And then, I think the other piece is just, start coming to the table with curiosity and asking questions. And I remember as a kid, we had to do those family tree exercises in school.
Yep.
I don't know if they still do them, but if they do, use those opportunities to really share stories. We are as a creature, we learn from storytelling.
Right.
So
great. And in your experience, what are the top 3 qualities that successful family enterprise leaders possess?
So any type of leader is one that comes to the table with curiosity, meaning that they don't know the answers to everything, but they ask really good questions. And being empathetic is another important quality. And I think that the third one is being an active listener. I know that's a catchphrase for some, but really taking the time to hear and respond. And it's not about parroting back. It's actually about internalizing what you hear and then reflecting back to the speaker to acknowledge that you heard them, but that you want to engage in more conversation. I think those are the top qualities of a good leader.
Awesome. And I appreciate you explaining a little bit more because, sometimes those catchphrases mean such different things to each person. So I appreciate that. Before we conclude our discussion today, I'd like to highlight some of the upcoming events this fall where listeners can engage in more conversations with you. Gena, could you kindly provide us with some insights onto what you're up to this fall?
Sure. So at the start of COVID, we started this Zoom series called In Conversation With, and we would bring in authors and prominent leaders in different industries to share their views on society, community, philanthropy, social impact investing, whatever the topic is. And so we're continuing that on. And we have 2 this fall on the books right now. So on September 13th, we have Paul Bourne, who is the founder and past CEO of the Tamarack Institute. And he is going to share his wisdom around how funders can fund systems level change. And then on November 15th, Peter Jazowick, who is a professor at the Telfer School of Business at the University of Ottawa, is going to be talking about enabling the next generation of leaders. And both of those are on Zoom, and they're both at 10 a.m. Mountain.
Fantastic. I wanted to make sure that we covered everything today. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with our audience that I didn't get to ask or we didn't get to touch on?
So I think the one thing that we didn't talk about is the rise of Indigenous philanthropy, especially in Canada as part of the Truth and Reconciliation movement. A couple of years ago, Carmen Sense engaged with an Indigenous philanthropy advisor, and it has changed so much, not just about how Carmen Sense approaches some of our advising, but more importantly, how we help non-Indigenous funders fund into Indigenous solutions. Because the complex, again, all these complex social issues are not just because of one problem or one trigger, right? Like there was a series of triggers. And so, and I know this could be a whole other podcast, but we really need to start as Canadian philanthropists. I can't speak to the American side, but as Canadian philanthropists, really understanding how does non-Indigenous philanthropy shape the narrative around engaging in the Truth and Reconciliation process, and how do we, as non-Indigenous funders, support the activities that of our Indigenous brothers and sisters or communities that are our neighbors that are part of the Canadian mosaic. And so right. I just wanted to give a shout out to the work that David is doing, because it's pretty awesome, actually.
That's great. And I think going back to just even your comments of being sensitive to the way that, you can't just throw money at a problem and hope that it solves it, knowing that the culture or the dynamics in that part of society is extremely important in all of those programs.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we purposely hired David Turner to help us with this because it would be disingenuous for me to advise a family on how to fund effectively into the First Nations communities or the Métis community, or it wouldn't work. And we know that it doesn't work.
Right.
And so being very mindful of the approach to philanthropy is different in the First Nations communities or in an Indigenous community than in our not European-centric approach.
Right. Well, I appreciate that. And thank you, Gena, for taking the time to share your expertise and experiences with us today. Your insights have been incredibly valuable, and we're grateful for your contribution to the episode.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Today, we had the privilege of diving deep into the world of family wealth with Gena Rotstein. I hope you found this conversation as enlightening and valuable as I did. Throughout our discussion, Gena shared incredible insights for building successful family charitable giving strategies and leaving a lasting legacy. We explored a multitude of insightful perspectives, touching on several crucial takeaways. Notably, the conversation highlighted the imperative of viewing substantial global challenges as a collective issue demanding collaborative solutions, rather than relegating them solely to the domain of the charitable sector. This perspective shift underscores the necessity for a united effort in addressing these problems. Additionally, we discussed the value of embracing failure as a fertile ground for learning, the need for donors to reevaluate their questioning approaches, and a contemplative examination of the legacy we aspire to leave behind. Moreover, the conversation showed how our ego is connected to philanthropy and that this giving is always political. We also considered the intricate balance between guaranteeing family security without amassing excessive wealth that may stifle ambition. These multifaceted approaches and insights collectively painted a comprehensive portrait of the complexities inherent in philanthropy and its broader implications on your own journey of legacy building. I want to express my deepest gratitude to Gena for generously sharing her time, expertise, and knowledge with us. Gena's expertise in social enterprise and philanthropy brings a unique perspective to our exploration of family enterprises. Her insights have provided us with actionable strategies to take control of our wealth and build a lasting legacy. If you'd like to learn more about Gena and her services, you can find them at karmaandsense.com. I highly encourage you to connect with them to explore how their expertise can support your family enterprise on its path to success. Thank you for joining me, Cory Gagnon, your host of Legacy Builders Podcast. It's my personal passion to explore with you these topics related to family wealth. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your preferred podcast platform. And don't forget to share this episode with family, friends, and colleagues who you care about. If you'd like to help support this show, you can do so by leaving a rating and review. If you have any questions about anything shared on today's episode, or have topics you'd like us to dive deeper into in future episodes, please let us know by emailing beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com. That's beaconfamilyoffice@ASSANTE.com. Legacy Builders, Strategies for Building Successful Family Enterprises is brought to you by Beacon Family Office at Asante. Are you worried about losing what you've created and seeking ways to transition your wealth across generations? Beacon Family Office at Asante supports our clients transition their wealth while maintaining relationships. If you'd like to access more content we've created, you can visit us at beaconfamilyoffice.com or for more details on our services and book an initial call. Thanks again for listening, and until next episode, stay intentional about building your legacy. This program was prepared by Cory Gagnon, who is a senior wealth advisor with Beacon Family Office at Asante Financial Management Limited. This is not an official program of Asante Financial Management, and the statements and opinions expressed during this podcast are not necessarily those of Asante Financial Management. This show is intended for general information only and may not apply to all listeners or investors. Please obtain professional financial advice or contact us at beaconfamilyoffice@asante.com or visit beaconfamilyoffice.com to discuss your particular circumstances prior to acting on the information presented.